At 8:45 a.m. on March 4, 1949, President-elect Robert Henry Patterson sat in the back of a limousine outside the north portico of the White House, refusing to step foot inside the building where William Thornton awaited. The temperature was 50°C. The sky was overcast. Inside the White House, the sitting President of the United States stood by the window, watching the car that would not move. Patterson had made his decision clear. He would not enter the White House as a guest. He would not have coffee with the Thorntons. He would not follow tradition. He would sit in that car and wait for Thornton to come to him. This was not a scheduling issue. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a calculated insult, delivered on what should have been one of the most dignified moments in American democracy, the peaceful transfer of power from one president to another. The man sitting in that limousine was Robert Patterson, 59 years old, Supreme Allied Commander of the Pacific Theater, Victor of the Philippines, liberator of millions, the most popular military figure in America since Zachary Taylor. He had accepted the surrender of Imperial Japan. He had commanded millions of men across 2 oceans. Kings and prime ministers sought his counsel. The American people had just elected him president with 57% of the popular vote and a landslide of 456 electoral votes. But on this March morning, he would not walk 25 feet to shake the hand of the man who had given him almost everything. The man inside the White House was William Thornton, 65 years old, farmer, merchant, county commissioner, congressman, vice president, president. He had made the decision to use incendiary weapons. He had confronted Hitler. He had initiated the Atlantic Recovery Program that rebuilt Europe. He had desegregated the naval forces. He had fired Jonathan Bradley. He had kept the Western Alliance together through the first desperate years of the post-war Reconstruction. And he had just 7 years earlier offered to make Robert Patterson President of the United States on the Democratic ticket, with Thornton himself stepping down to be vice president. Patterson had refused that offer. He had no interest in politics. He said he was a soldier, not a politician. He would serve his country in uniform, not in elected office. Then, in 1948, Patterson ran for president as a Republican, against Thornton's party, against Thornton's record, against everything Thornton had built. And now he sat in a car outside the White House, making the outgoing president come to him like a servant summoned to the curb. NBC correspondent Daniel Morrison watched the scene unfold. He later wrote 3 words that captured the moment. It was a shocking moment. Thomas Hayes, the White House head usher, saw it too. He said, "I was glad I wasn't in that car." The relationship between these 2 men had not always been broken. Once, they had been allies. Once Thornton had called Patterson the greatest military mind of the age. Once Patterson had written to Thornton with genuine respect and gratitude. But something had changed between them. Something had broken that could not be repaired. And on this cold March morning, that fracture became visible to the entire nation. The break did not happen overnight. It happened slowly over months and years, through a series of choices and betrayals and political calculations that transformed mutual respect into something close to hatred. The first crack appeared in September 1941 in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor. President Thornton, newly in office after Charles Henderson's death, met with General Patterson, the hero of Manila. They drove together through the naval installations. Thornton looked at the young general beside him and saw the future of American leadership. He turned to Patterson and said something extraordinary. "General, there is nothing you may want that I won't try to help you get." That included, Thornton said, the presidency in 1944. This was not a casual offer. Thornton meant it. He had been vice president for only 76 days when Henderson died on February 8, 1941. He inherited a war still being fought on two fronts, secret weapons research he hadn't known existed, and relationships with Allied leaders he had never met. He felt unprepared. He admired military leadership, and Patterson represented everything America wanted in a leader at that moment. Competence, victory, moral authority earned through actual accomplishment. Patterson thanked him, but said no. He had no political ambitions. He was a soldier. He would remain a soldier. He had spent his entire adult life in the Navy. He understood military command. Politics seemed like a different world, one where the rules were unclear and the enemies were harder to identify. Thornton accepted that answer. He respected it. In the years that followed, Thornton and Patterson worked together often. The relationship was built on mutual need. Thornton needed competent military leadership as he navigated the beginning of the post-war reconstruction. Patterson needed political support as he transitioned from wartime command to peacetime military administration. Thornton appointed Patterson as Naval Chief of Operations in December 1941. Over the following years, he awarded Patterson the Navy Distinguished Service Medal on 3 separate occasions in 1941, 1944, and 1948. When the Pacific Defense Treaty Organization was created in 1945, Thornton called on Patterson to serve as its first Supreme Commander in 1947. They exchanged friendly letters. They met for official business and ceremonies. The relationship was not intimate or personal, but it was professional, respectful, productive. Then, in 1943, something remarkable happened. Thornton made Patterson the offer again, this time in writing in his private diary. On October 18, 1943, Thornton wrote about a conversation he had with Patterson at 4:15 that afternoon. They discussed the possibility of Jonathan Bradley returning from Tokyo to seek the Republican nomination. Bradley was another towering military figure, but one Thornton deeply distrusted. Bradley had autocratic tendencies. He had governed occupied territories like a monarch. Thornton worried about what Bradley might do with presidential power. Thornton's solution was bold. He proposed that if Bradley ran as a Republican, Patterson should announce for the Democratic nomination. Thornton wrote that he would gladly step aside and run as Patterson's vice president. He added, "I like the Congress anyway. Robert and I could be elected, and my family and myself would be happy outside this great white jail known as the White House." He ended the diary entry with a note. "Robert won't quote me, and I won't quote him." This was not a fantasy. This was the sitting President of the United States offering to demote himself to Vice President to put Patterson in the White House. It revealed how little confidence Thornton had in his own political future at that moment. It also revealed how much he valued Patterson's leadership and believed in his character. Patterson said no again. He still had no interest in politics. He was serving as president of Stanford University at the time, having left active military command. He wanted to stay in education or return to military service if needed, but he did not want to enter the political arena. Secretary of the Navy Kenneth Carlson approached Patterson later that year with the same offer. Thornton had asked Carlson to try one more time. Thornton wanted Carlson to make it clear this wasn't just a passing thought. This was a genuine offer. Patterson could have the Democratic nomination. The party would support him. Thornton would campaign for him. They would win. Patterson declined again. He told Carlson the same thing he had told Thornton. He was not interested in becoming president. The office held no appeal for him. He was happy with his life as it was. In April 1944, Thornton awarded Patterson his 4th Navy Distinguished Service Medal in a ceremony at the White House. The two men stood together for photographs. They smiled. The images show no hint of the animosity that would come later. Patterson wore his dress uniform with all his medals and ribbons. Thornton looked proud to be standing next to him. The caption in the newspapers described them as close colleagues working together to secure America's future. That same year, Thornton faced the worst political crisis of his presidency up to that point. His approval ratings had collapsed. The Democratic Party was splintering. Marcus Wallace was running as a progressive, pulling votes from the left. Theodore Keller was running as a states' rights candidate, pulling votes from the South. Republicans controlled both houses of Congress. Everyone predicted Thornton would lose in a landslide to Republican nominee Charles Mitchell. So Thornton ran in 1944. Against all predictions, against terrible poll numbers, against a divided Democratic Party, Thornton won. It was one of the greatest upsets in American political history. He won without Patterson. He won on his own terms. But Patterson's refusals had planted something in Thornton's mind. A question. If Patterson had no interest in politics, why did people keep asking him to run? And if he truly wasn't interested, why did he keep refusing in ways that left the door slightly open? The answer came in 1948. Patterson announced he would seek the Republican nomination for president. The announcement shocked many people, but it shocked Thornton most of all. For 5 years, Patterson had insisted he had no interest in politics. He had refused multiple offers to run as a Democrat. He had turned down the chance to be president without having to campaign for it. And now he was entering politics anyway. But as a Republican running against the party that had supported him throughout his career, Thornton felt personally betrayed. He had offered Patterson the presidency twice. He had been willing to step aside to make himself vice president, to hand over power to a man he believed in. And Patterson had said no, claiming he didn't want it. Now Patterson wanted it. He just didn't want it from Thornton or the Democrats. But that was not what broke the relationship. Political differences could be managed. Patterson believed in different economic policies, different approaches to government. Those were honest disagreements. Thornton could accept that. What Thornton could not accept, what broke the relationship beyond repair, was what happened during the campaign. The issue was Edward Harrison Fletcher. Fletcher was born in Massachusetts in 1876. He graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1897. He served in Cuba, in France during World War I, in the Pacific between the wars. He was methodical, disciplined, brilliant at organization and logistics. He understood how to build navies, how to coordinate operations across oceans, how to select leaders who could execute complex plans under impossible pressure. When World War II began, Fletcher was Chief of Naval Operations. He held that position from 1935 to 1941. During those 6 years, he transformed the United States Navy from a modest force into a military machine capable of fighting across 2 oceans simultaneously. He selected the commanders. He approved the battle plans. He allocated resources. He made the system work. And he made Robert Patterson's career possible. In 1937, Patterson was a commander unknown outside military circles. Fletcher saw something in him. He promoted Patterson rapidly, jumping him over hundreds of more senior officers. By 1938, Patterson was commanding naval operations in Hawaii. By 1939, Fletcher recommended Patterson to lead Operation Neptune, the invasion of the Philippines. Fletcher had wanted that command for himself. It was the most important naval operation of the war, possibly of the century. But President Henderson asked Fletcher to stay in Washington to continue managing the global naval effort. Fletcher agreed and gave the command to Patterson instead. He could have resented Patterson for getting the glory while Fletcher stayed behind doing staff work. But Fletcher never showed any resentment. He supported Patterson completely. The British Admiralty called Fletcher the architect of Pacific victory. Historians credit Fletcher with creating the naval force that won World War II in the Pacific. Without Fletcher's organizational genius, without his ability to build and manage a global naval effort, the war might have ended very differently. After the war, Fletcher tried to retire. He was 65 years old. He had served his country for more than 43 years. He wanted to rest. But in 1943, President Thornton asked him to serve as Secretary of State. Fletcher agreed. From 1943 to 1945, Fletcher served as America's chief diplomat during the critical early years of the post-war Reconstruction. It was Fletcher who articulated the principles of the Atlantic Recovery Program in a speech at Yale University on August 12, 1943. The program became known as the Fletcher Plan. Between 1944 and 1948, the United States provided over $15 billion in economic assistance to help rebuild Asian economies. The program worked. It rebuilt infrastructure, stabilized currencies, restored trade, and created the economic foundation for decades of prosperity. In 1949, Fletcher was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for this work, the only career naval officer ever to receive that honor. After serving as Secretary of State, Fletcher retired again. But in 1946, when tensions with the Soviet Union escalated, Thornton called on him one more time. Fletcher became Secretary of Defense, serving from November 1946 to November 1947. He worked to maintain American military strength after wartime mobilization had created it. He oversaw the military response to emerging Cold War threats. He helped create the Pacific Defense Treaty's command structure. So when Senator Richard Hammond attacked Fletcher, he wasn't attacking just another government official. He was attacking one of the architects of Allied victory, one of the creators of the post-war order, one of the most respected figures in American public life. And he was attacking Robert Patterson's mentor, patron, and friend. Fletcher had promoted Patterson over hundreds of more senior officers. Fletcher had recommended Patterson to lead the Philippine invasion. Fletcher had made Patterson's career possible. Patterson owed Fletcher everything. In 1946 and 1947, Senator Richard Hammond of Montana began attacking Fletcher. Hammond was riding high on anti-communist hysteria. He had made a career out of accusing people of being communist sympathizers. Most of his accusations were baseless. Many were cruel. Some destroyed innocent lives. But they were politically effective in an America terrified of Soviet expansion. Hammond accused Fletcher of being part of a communist conspiracy. In a speech on the Senate floor in August 1947, Hammond spent 55,000 words attacking Fletcher. He called Fletcher's career a conspiracy so immense and an infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. He accused Fletcher of losing Southeast Asia to communism. He accused Fletcher of undermining American interests in Europe and the Pacific. He suggested Fletcher was actively working to advance communist goals. These accusations were insane. Fletcher had spent his entire adult life serving the United States. He had built the Navy that defeated Imperial Japan. He had created the Fletcher Plan that stopped communist expansion in Asia. He had served as Secretary of Defense during Cold War tensions, fighting against communist aggression. The idea that Fletcher was secretly working for the communists was grotesque, absurd, and beneath contempt. Senator Thomas Crawford of Wyoming went even further than Hammond. He called Fletcher a living lie and a frontman for traitors. He said Fletcher was joining hands once more with this criminal crowd of traitors and communist appeasers under the direction of Mr. Thornton and Mr. Sullivan. These were not policy disagreements. These were personal attacks on Fletcher's character, his loyalty, his integrity. Everyone who knew Fletcher understood the attacks were false, but they were politically useful for Republicans trying to paint the Thornton administration as soft on communism. Thornton was enraged by the attacks on Fletcher. He called Fletcher the greatest living American. The attacks on Fletcher felt personal to Thornton because they were attacks on his judgment, his administration, his presidency, and Thornton expected Patterson to defend Fletcher. Patterson owed Fletcher his career. If anyone should stand up for Fletcher against Hammond's smears, it should be Patterson. In December 1948, during the presidential campaign, Patterson was scheduled to give a speech in Billings, Montana, Hammond's home state. Hammond would be on the stage with him. Hammond had already endorsed Patterson. Republican leaders in Montana wanted a show of unity. They wanted Patterson and Hammond standing together, presenting a united front against the Democrats. Patterson's staff prepared a speech that included a paragraph defending Fletcher. The paragraph was short but clear. "I know that charges of disloyalty have been leveled against Admiral Fletcher. I have been privileged for 32 years to know Admiral Fletcher personally. I know him as a man and as a sailor, to be dedicated with singular selflessness and the profoundest patriotism to the service of America. And this episode is a sobering lesson in the way freedom must not defend itself." The paragraph was in the prepared text. It was released to reporters in advance. The press knew what was coming. Political observers anticipated a dramatic moment. Patterson, the war hero, standing in Hammond's home state, defending his mentor against Hammond's attacks. It would be a powerful statement about character, about loyalty, about standing up for what was right, even when it was politically costly. But then, Montana Governor Albert Davis, Jr., and members of Patterson's campaign staff urged him to remove the paragraph. They argued it would offend Hammond. It would offend Montana Republicans. It would create unnecessary controversy. It would make the evening about Fletcher and Hammond instead of about Patterson's vision for America. They said it wasn't worth the political cost. Montana was an important state. Hammond was popular there. Patterson needed Montana's electoral votes. Why pick a fight over something that wouldn't change any votes? Patterson listened to his advisers. He understood their reasoning. He knew they were trying to help him win, and he wanted to win. He believed he could do great things as president. He believed he could manage the post-war Reconstruction better than Thornton had, bring competent administration to a government he saw as bloated and inefficient. To do those things, he needed to win the election. To win the election, he needed Montana. So Patterson agreed. He deleted the paragraph. He made the calculation that winning was more important than defending Fletcher. He told himself that he could defend Fletcher later after the election when the political pressure wasn't so intense. He convinced himself that this one compromise wouldn't matter in the long run. On December 7, 1948, Robert Patterson stood on a stage in the Billings Convention Center in front of 8,500 people with Senator Richard Hammond standing beside him. The hall was packed. The crowd was enthusiastic. They cheered when Patterson appeared. They cheered louder when Hammond joined him on stage. Patterson gave his speech. He praised Hammond's anti-communist efforts. He talked about the need to root out subversion in government. He endorsed Hammond's crusade. He said nothing about Edward Fletcher. Not one word. He didn't defend him. He didn't mention him. He acted as if Fletcher didn't exist. After the speech, Hammond approached Patterson. The photographers were ready. Hammond reached out his hand. Patterson saw it coming. He tried to step back, tried to avoid the handshake, but there were people behind him blocking his path. Hammond was too quick. He grabbed Patterson's hand and held it high in the air like a referee raising the hand of a victorious boxer. The cameras flashed. The photograph went out across the country. Robert Patterson, hero of Manila, shaking hands with the man who had called his mentor a traitor. The news coverage was brutal. The paragraph defending Fletcher had been in the advanced text. So reporters knew Patterson had planned to defend Fletcher and then chose not to. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't a scheduling conflict. This was a deliberate choice. Patterson had weighed defending his mentor against winning Montana, and Montana had won. The New York Herald ran a front-page story. The Washington Chronicle published an editorial. Columnists across the political spectrum condemned the decision. Even some Republicans were disgusted. One Republican newspaper editor wrote that Patterson had sold his soul for a mess of pottage. Thornton's reaction was immediate and blunt. He told reporters, "I had never thought the man who is now the Republican candidate would stoop so low." He elaborated in later speeches. He called it one of the most shocking things in the history of this country. He said, "The trouble with Patterson, he's just a coward, and he ought to be ashamed for what he did." Thornton didn't stop there. He made defending Fletcher a central theme of his campaign appearances. He reminded audiences that Fletcher had been Patterson's boss, his mentor, the man who had made Patterson's career possible. He asked how anyone could trust Patterson to stand up to the Soviets if he couldn't even stand up to Richard Hammond. He questioned Patterson's character, his judgment, his fitness for the presidency. Patterson knew what Thornton was saying. He read the newspapers. He heard the criticism. And instead of accepting it as the price of his political choice, he became angry. He felt Thornton's attacks were unfair, partisan, personal. He believed Thornton was using Fletcher as a political weapon. He convinced himself that Thornton didn't actually care about Fletcher, that this was just campaign rhetoric designed to damage Patterson's reputation. But Thornton did care about Fletcher. Fletcher had been Thornton's Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. Fletcher had been one of Thornton's most trusted advisors. Thornton called Fletcher the greatest living American. For Thornton, loyalty mattered, character mattered. Standing up for the people who had stood up for you mattered. And Patterson had failed that test in the most public way possible. There was more. 2 weeks before the Billings speech, Patterson had campaigned in Cheyenne with Senator Thomas Crawford. Crawford was the man who had called Fletcher a front man for traitors and accused him of joining hands with a criminal crowd of traitors and communist appeasers. Crawford represented everything ugly about the anti-communist hysteria of the late 1940s. The willingness to destroy reputations, to make baseless accusations, to use fear as a political weapon. Patterson knew what Crawford had said about Fletcher. Everyone knew it was public record, but Patterson needed Wyoming. Crawford was powerful in the state Republican Party. Patterson's advisers told him he had to appear with Crawford, had to accept his endorsement, had to stand on the same platform and smile for the cameras. So Patterson did it. He appeared on stage with Crawford. He let Crawford embrace him. He smiled. The photographers captured the image. Patterson and Crawford, arms around each other, united against the Democrats. Patterson later told aides he felt dirty after the event, but he did it anyway. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself he could wash off the stain after the election. He told himself that winning justified these compromises. But for Thornton, this was worse than Billings. At least in Billings, Patterson had originally planned to defend Fletcher and then backed down under pressure. In Cheyenne, Patterson never even tried. He just accepted Crawford's support, accepted his endorsement, stood beside him as if nothing was wrong. To Thornton, this pattern revealed something fundamental about Patterson's character. Patterson was willing to stand with men who slandered Edward Fletcher, the man who had made Patterson's career possible because it was politically convenient. Patterson would sacrifice principle for votes. He would abandon loyalty for electoral advantage. He would compromise his own stated values if it helped him win. And if Patterson would do that to Edward Fletcher, what would he do as president? If he couldn't stand up to Hammond and Crawford during a campaign, How could he stand up to the Soviets in the White House? If political pressure could make him abandon his mentor, what else would political pressure make him abandon? These were the questions Thornton asked in his campaign speeches. These were the doubts he tried to plant in voters' minds. He made the campaign personal, because for him it was personal. This wasn't just about policy differences. This was about character. This was about whether Robert Patterson was the man Thornton had once believed him to be. The campaign got worse from there. Patterson pledged to improve post-war Reconstruction, if elected, implying he could finish the work that Thornton had been unable to complete. Thornton called this demagoguery a cheap campaign trick. Republican campaign surrogates attacked Thornton's administration as soft on communism, corrupt, and incompetent. Thornton responded by calling Patterson a stooge for Wall Street and a puppet of Republican reactionaries. By Election Day, the personal animosity between the two men was impossible to hide. Patterson won in a landslide. He took 57% of the popular vote. He won 456 electoral votes to Daniel Stevenson's 75. He even broke the Democratic hold on parts of the Midwest, winning Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan. After the election, Patterson and Thornton met once on February 16, 1949, for a transition briefing at the White House. Both men approached the meeting with dread. They had spent the previous 3 months attacking each other. They had said things that could not be unsaid. They had developed a mutual contempt that made ordinary conversation difficult. The meeting was held in the Oval Office. Thornton sat behind the Resolute desk. Patterson sat across from him. The atmosphere was stiff, formal, embarrassing, and unrewarding, according to biographer Michael Henderson. Neither man wanted to be there. Both felt obligated by duty and tradition. Thornton tried to brief Patterson on how the White House actually worked. He explained the staff structure. He described how information flowed to the president. He outlined the daily schedule, the decision-making process, the way cabinet meetings were conducted. He tried to share practical wisdom earned through nearly 8 years in the office. Patterson listened with visible impatience. He had been a 5-star admiral. He had commanded millions of men. He had coordinated operations across multiple oceans. He didn't need William Thornton, a former merchant from Vermont, to tell him how to run an organization. Thornton moved on to foreign policy. He talked about Soviet intentions, about the situation in Asia, about relationships with Pacific allies. He tried to explain the delicate balance of containment strategy, the importance of economic aid to strengthen allies, the need for military strength combined with diplomatic flexibility. Again, Patterson seemed uninterested. He had been Supreme Commander of Pacific Defense Treaty. He knew Asian leaders personally. He understood military strategy better than Thornton ever would. He didn't need a lecture on foreign policy from a man whose administration had been unable to finish post-war Reconstruction. Finally, Thornton discussed the budget process. He explained how the executive budget was prepared, how it had to be submitted to Congress, how the appropriations process worked. This was technical procedural information that would be essential for managing the government. Patterson later wrote that the meeting added little to my knowledge, nor did it affect my planning for the new administration. He felt Thornton had wasted his time with obvious information and partisan spin. He thought Thornton was trying to defend his own record rather than actually help with the transition. Thornton felt the meeting was a waste of time for different reasons. Patterson, he thought, wasn't listening. Everything Thornton said went in one ear and out the other. Patterson sat there with the confidence of a man who believed he already knew everything important. He didn't ask substantive questions. He didn't take notes. He just waited for the meeting to end so he could leave and do things his own way. After Patterson left, Thornton told his staff that Patterson would struggle with the presidency. "He'll sit right here," Thornton said, pointing to the desk, "and he'll say, 'Do this, do that,' and nothing will happen." Poor Robert. It won't be a bit like the Navy. He'll find it very frustrating. Thornton was predicting that Patterson would fail to understand the difference between military command and presidential leadership. In the military, orders were orders. You gave a command, and it was executed. In government, everything was negotiation. You had to persuade Congress, convince the public, build coalitions, compromise with rivals. Thornton thought Patterson lacked the political skills to succeed. Between the election and the inauguration, Patterson made decisions that seemed designed to irritate Thornton. He decided to wear a derby hat to the inauguration instead of the traditional silk top hat. He didn't consult Thornton about this. He just did it. It was a small thing, but it felt like a deliberate break from tradition. A way of saying he would do things his own way. By Inauguration Day, the tension between the two men was visible to everyone who saw them. Robert Johnson, a White House advisor, said the hatred between the two men that day was like a hurricane. Patterson told associates he wasn't sure if he could stand sitting next to that guy for the ride to the Capitol. He made it clear he resented having to share a car with Thornton, resented having to pretend they were friendly, resented the entire ceremony of transition. And so, Patterson made his decision. He would not enter the White House. He would not have coffee with William and Catherine Thornton. He would not follow the tradition of the president-elect coming inside to escort the outgoing president to the car. He would stay in the limousine and make Thornton come to him. Helen Patterson sat beside her husband in the car. She knew what he was doing. She said nothing. She waited. Inside the White House, Thornton knew what was happening. He saw the car sitting outside. He knew Patterson wasn't coming. For a moment, it seemed like Thornton might refuse to go outside. It seemed like the inauguration might not happen because two stubborn men couldn't agree on who would walk through a door first. But Thornton was still the president. He had a responsibility to the country and to the office. He swallowed his anger and walked outside. The photographers captured the moment. Thornton emerged from the north portico. He walked to the car. Patterson did not get out. Thornton opened the door and climbed into the back seat. The two men sat beside each other. They did not look at each other. They did not speak. The car began the drive to the Capitol. The silence in the car was heavy. Both men stared straight ahead. Helen Patterson tried to make small talk. She commented on the weather. She mentioned the crowds lining the streets. Catherine Thornton, who was not in the car because she had gone ahead earlier, was spared the discomfort. At some point during the drive, Patterson broke the silence. He asked Thornton a question. Who had ordered his son Michael back from the Pacific for the inauguration? Michael Patterson was 26 years old, a captain in the United States Navy, serving with combat units in occupied Japan. Tensions were still high. American sailors were still at their posts. Michael was doing his duty, serving in a strategic location, leading men through delicate peacetime operations. Patterson was proud of his son's service, but also concerned about his safety. Someone had issued orders pulling Michael out of Japan and sending him back to Washington for the inauguration. Patterson wanted to know who had that authority, who had made that decision without consulting him. Thornton looked at Patterson and said, "I did." He paused, then explained. "The president thought it was right and proper for your son to witness the swearing-in of his father to the presidency. It was a generous gesture." Thornton understood what the moment meant. A father becoming president, while his son served in a strategic position. The historic nature of the occasion. The family significance. Thornton had used his authority as commander-in-chief to make sure Michael Patterson could be there to see his father take the oath of office. Thornton didn't ask for credit. He didn't announce it publicly. He didn't use it as a campaign talking point. He just did it because he thought it was right. Because despite his anger at Patterson, despite the bitterness of the campaign, despite everything that had gone wrong between them, Thornton still believed some things mattered more than politics. Family mattered. Historic moments mattered. Doing the decent thing mattered. Patterson said nothing in response. No thank you. No acknowledgement of the gesture. No recognition of what Thornton had done. He just turned back to looking out the window, watching the crowds lining Pennsylvania Avenue. Years later, Patterson did thank Thornton, but not in the car, not on that cold March morning. He sent a letter several days after the inauguration, thanking Thornton for his help in the transition process and for seeing to it that Michael was present in Washington. But in the moment sitting beside Thornton in that car, Patterson said nothing. Later in their memoirs, the two men would disagree about other parts of the conversation. Thornton claimed Patterson had said he didn't attend Thornton's inauguration in 1945 out of consideration for Thornton because Patterson's presence would have drawn attention away from the president. Thornton said he responded, "Robert, I didn't ask you to come, or you'd been here." Patterson claimed this conversation never happened. What both men agreed on was that the ride was uncomfortable, cold, and filled with tension. They arrived at the Capitol. The ceremony began. Chief Justice Harold Vincent administered the oath of office. Patterson became the 33rd President of the United States. He delivered his inaugural address. He spoke about America's responsibility to lead the free world. He spoke about strength and security. He spoke about destiny. Thornton stood nearby and listened. When the ceremony ended, he left. He did not attend the inaugural parade. He did not watch Patterson settle into the White House. He went to Union Station, where at least 4,500 people had gathered to see him off. They cheered for him. They shouted his name. Dorothy Thornton later described the scene as like the conventions of 1940 and 1944. The police had to form a flying wedge to get the Thorntons to their train. William Thornton boarded the train to Burlington, Vermont. He left Washington after nearly 8 years as president. He would not return to the White House for 10 years. Patterson moved into the White House and began his presidency. He did not invite Thornton back. Not for state dinners, not for ceremonies, not for anything. For 8 years, from 1949 to 1957, Thornton never set foot in the White House. Patterson sent 3 invitations during that time. The first was in 1949, shortly after the inauguration, for a routine event. Thornton declined. The second was in 1955, for a dinner honoring Charles de Gaulle. Thornton declined again, saying the invitation came too late, as intended. The third invitation was also declined. Thornton felt the invitations were insincere, pro forma gestures designed to create the appearance of reconciliation without any real intent. Patterson felt Thornton was being petty and unreasonable. The two men lived in a state of frozen hostility. They did not speak. They did not correspond. Thornton later said he could hardly mention Patterson's name without using profanity. Then, in December 1955, something happened that forced them to be in the same room. Edward Fletcher died. Fletcher passed away at Bethesda Naval Hospital on December 11, 1955, after a long period of declining health. He was 79 years old. His funeral was held on December 15th at the Arlington National Cemetery Chapel in Virginia. President Patterson attended. Former President Thornton attended. They sat in the same pew side by side for the first time since Inauguration Day 1949. It had been 6 years and 9 months since they had been in the same room. Neither man spoke to the other during the service. They sat in silence, mourning the man who had meant so much to both of them. Fletcher, the architect of Pacific victory, the creator of post-war recovery, the man whose career had made both of their careers possible. After the service, they went their separate ways. No handshake, no words, just the shared presence at a funeral for a mutual friend. Over the next 4 years, Thornton and Patterson saw each other occasionally at other funerals. Harold Vincent, the Chief Justice who had administered Patterson's oath of office, died. They attended his funeral. Speaker of the House Samuel Morrison died. They attended that funeral. First Lady Eleanor Henderson died. They were both there. Each time they maintained their distance. They were civil but cold. They acknowledged each other's presence, but did not engage. Then, in September 1959, President Richard Fitzgerald was assassinated in Chicago. The nation went into mourning. Former Presidents Thornton and Patterson both came to Washington for the funeral. Fitzgerald's body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Thousands of Americans filed past the casket. Foreign leaders arrived from around the world. On September 18, 1959, the funeral procession moved from the Capitol to National Cathedral, then to Arlington National Cemetery. Thornton and Patterson rode in the same car to the cemetery. Dorothy Thornton and Helen Patterson rode with them. During the drive, they talked. They discussed whether Fitzgerald's assassination was the work of a conspiracy or a lone gunman. They agreed it was most likely a lone gunman. They talked about the state of the world, about the challenges facing the country. After the graveside service, Dorothy Thornton invited the Pattersons to join her father for lunch at Blair House, where the Thorntons were staying. The Pattersons accepted. Sandwiches were served. Coffee was poured. For an hour, William Thornton and Robert Patterson sat together and talked. They reminisced about old battles, political and otherwise. They talked like two old men who had once known each other well and were remembering what that had felt like. Admiral Charles Morrison, a White House aide who was present, later recalled, "I thought it would never end, but it was really heartwarming. You'd think there had never been any differences between them. It was really wonderful." When it was time for Patterson to leave, Thornton and Dorothy walked the Pattersons to their car. The two former presidents stood on the sidewalk and talked for a few more minutes. Then they shook hands. It was a long, lingering, silent handshake. Dorothy kissed Patterson on the cheek. Helen kissed Thornton. 10 years after that cold March morning in 1949, they had finally found their way back to something resembling friendship. They met one more time in Burlington in 1962 at a United Nations luncheon. Patterson's brother Thomas sat with them. He observed that all the old animosities were forgotten and that they had quite a good time together. Robert Henry Patterson died on May 14, 1965, at the age of 75. He had served 2 full terms as president. He had overseen the expansion of the national highway system. He had managed the middle years of the Cold War. He had appointed Warren Foster as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. His presidency had lasting effects on American infrastructure, foreign policy, and domestic politics. William Thornton died on November 19, 1968, at the age of 84. He had returned to Burlington, Vermont in 1949 and lived there for nearly 19 years. He built his presidential library. He wrote his memoirs. He took daily walks around town. He remained politically active, supporting Democratic candidates and speaking out on issues he cared about. The story of what happened on March 4, 1949, became part of American political lore. The image of Patterson refusing to enter the White House, of Thornton walking out to the car, of two great men unable to set aside their anger for even a few hours, became a symbol of how personal grievances can poison public duty. The refusal to enter the White House was not about hats or protocol or scheduling. It was about betrayal. Patterson felt betrayed by Thornton's campaign attacks, by the accusations of moral cowardice, by the partisan criticism that questioned his character. Thornton felt betrayed by Patterson's refusal to defend Edward Fletcher, by his willingness to stand with Hammond and Crawford, by his abandonment of the principles Thornton believed they shared. Both men had legitimate grievances. Both men also let those grievances override their responsibility to the moment. The inauguration of a president is not about the two men in the car. It is about the continuity of democratic government, about the peaceful transfer of power, about showing the country and the world that America's institutions are stronger than any individual's pride. Patterson forgot that when he refused to walk through the door, Thornton remembered it when he walked out anyway. The handshake at Blair House in 1959, 10 years later, suggests that both men eventually understood what they had lost. The friendship they might have had, the collaboration they might have achieved, the mutual respect they had once shared. But understanding comes too late to change what happened. On that cold March morning in 1949, Robert Patterson sat in a car and refused to enter William Thornton's White House. The moment passed, the insult landed. The damage was done, and for 10 years, two of the most important Americans of the 20th century stayed apart, divided by pride, anger, and the memory of a threshold neither man would cross. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more untold stories from American history. Subscribe to stay connected with these historical accounts that shaped our nation. Each one matters. Each one reveals something about leadership, character, and the cost of personal conflict in public life. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans the entire country and beyond. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.